The morning air in Montana was unlike anything ever recorded before, a bone-chilling, record-breaking -40 degrees. The howling wind cut through the valley like an unforgiving blade, turning the landscape into an icy wasteland. Inside his cozy cabin, Tom Wilson sipped his steaming coffee, watching the frozen world outside. But his peaceful morning shattered in an instant. His trembling hands nearly dropped the cup as he saw something impossible through the frost-covered window. A massive grizzly bear, her fur stiff with ice, was standing upright, knocking on the glass. Not in aggression. Not in search of food. But with deliberate, rhythmic taps, almost as if she were pleading. Behind her, 3 small cubs huddled together, their tiny bodies violently shivering. One of them suddenly collapsed into the snow, barely moving. And then, the mother bear did something that sent chills down Tom's spine, chills that had nothing to do with the cold. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he took a step closer to the frost-covered window. The sight before him was beyond belief. The massive grizzly bear, her thick fur stiff and crystallized with ice, stood on her hind legs, pressing her enormous paws against the glass. Her claws, though fearsome, made gentle, deliberate taps, a pattern too rhythmic to be random. It was as if she was trying to communicate. Tom's eyes flickered beyond her, 3 tiny cubs huddled together, barely standing, their frail bodies shivering violently in the brutal wind. The snow around them swirled mercilessly, and then, one of the cubs collapsed. The mother bear reacted instantly. With a speed and precision that defied belief, she rushed to her fallen cub, scooping it up carefully in her powerful jaws. But instead of retreating, she turned back to the window, pressing the tiny, motionless body against the glass. Tom could see it up close now. The cub's fur was coated in ice, its little chest barely rising. The mother bear's deep, intelligent eyes locked onto Tom's. There was no aggression, no threat, only a desperate plea. She stepped back, raised both paws, and held them together in a motion that could only be described as a silent prayer. It was then that Tom realized, she wasn't just asking for help, she was begging for it. Tom stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was unfolding before him. This wasn't normal animal behavior. The mother bear lifted her cub again, pressing its tiny, ice-covered body against the window. Her massive paws trembled as she adjusted her grip, making sure Tom could see the cub's fragile form. The little one's breaths were weak, barely visible against the frost-covered glass. Its tiny limbs hung limp, its body still except for the faintest movement of its chest. The mother bear's dark eyes were filled with something beyond instinct, beyond survival. It was a look of pure, unmistakable desperation. She lowered the cub for a moment, nuzzling it softly, as if willing it to hold on. Then, in one heart-stopping motion, she lifted it once more and pressed it firmly against the glass. Tom's heart pounded. She was showing him not just the cub, but the urgency of the moment. Outside, the howling wind roared, the temperature dropping even lower. The other 2 cubs stumbled in the snow, their tiny bodies convulsing as the cold drained the life from them. The mother bear let out a soft, gut-wrenching whimper, a sound that shouldn't have come from a creature of her size. It was almost a plea. A plea that shattered every rule of nature. A plea that left Tom with only 2 choices, act now, or watch them die. Tom's pulse pounded as the mother bear took a step back from the window. Then, in a moment that defied all logic, she did something that left him breathless. She rose onto her hind legs, lifted both massive paws, and held them together, like a prayer. It wasn't an instinctual movement. It wasn't a random gesture. It was deliberate. It was communication. Tom's hands trembled. Was he imagining this? Was this bear really begging? The wind howled louder, snow whipping against the window. But the mother bear didn't move away. Instead, she lowered herself and began carving patterns in the snow with her paw. At first, the markings seemed random. But as Tom watched closely, he noticed a pattern, circles, lines, deliberate shapes. She would draw, then look at him, then back at her cubs, as if trying to say, "Please, help them." His breath turned shallow. This wasn't just a wild animal reacting to danger. This was something else. Something bigger. Outside, the cub's shivering grew weaker. Time was slipping away. Tom had spent years in Montana, but never had he seen anything like this. And in that moment, he knew he had to act. Tom's mind raced as he stood frozen in place. This couldn't be real. Outside, the cubs' movements were slowing. Their tiny bodies, once trembling violently, were now barely shivering at all. The smallest one, the one the mother had pressed against the glass, was dangerously still. Tom's gut twisted. They were running out of time. The mother bear must have sensed it too. She turned back to her cubs, nudging them with her nose, trying to keep them awake. But even her desperate attempts couldn't fight against the brutal cold. Then, she did something that shattered every doubt in Tom's mind. She turned to him one last time, pressed her frost-covered paw against the window, and let out a low, mournful sound, a sound so full of pain and urgency that it sent a shiver down Tom's spine. Tom swallowed hard. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was a mother, fighting for her children. He took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists. He had to make a choice. And whatever he decided, would change everything. Slowly, he reached for the door handle. Tom's heart pounded as his fingers curled around the cold metal doorknob. Every instinct screamed at him, this was a wild animal. A grizzly. A predator. But his gut told him something else. With a deep breath, he cracked the door open, just enough for the freezing air to rush in. The mother bear didn't move. She simply watched him, her breath misting in the icy air. Then, with astonishing gentleness, she turned to her smallest cub, still unmoving in the snow. Carefully, delicately, she picked it up in her jaws. Step by step, she approached the open door, moving with a restraint that no wild animal should have. She didn't barge in. She didn't push her way forward. Instead, she placed the tiny cub just inside the threshold and stepped back. She waited. Tom's breath caught. She wasn't forcing her way inside, she was asking for permission. Outside, the other two cubs struggled to stand. The mother bear looked at them, then back at Tom. She had made her move. Now, it was his turn to decide, would he let them in? Tom stepped back as the mother bear gently nudged her smallest cub further inside. The warmth of the cabin instantly melted the frost on its fur, and for the first time, its tiny chest rose and fell with a stronger breath. But what happened next defied everything Tom thought he knew about wild animals. Instead of rushing inside, the mother bear paused at the doorway. She turned to her other cubs, chuffing softly, and with remarkable patience, guided them in, one by one. Once inside, she didn't roam, didn't panic, didn't act aggressively. Instead, she gathered her cubs in the farthest corner of the room, keeping them close, keeping them controlled. Tom watched in shock as the cubs, instead of acting wild or restless, mimicked their mother. They sat still, their wide eyes observing the new space, but making no sudden movements. Then, something even more astonishing happened. One of the cubs, wobbling on unsteady legs, started moving toward a table. Before it could touch anything, the mother bear gently blocked it with her paw. A warning. A lesson. Tom swallowed hard. This wasn't just survival, this was understanding. And it was changing everything he believed. The warmth had returned to the cubs' tiny bodies. Their shivering had stopped, their breathing had steadied. They were safe. Tom expected the mother bear to stay longer, to rest, to recover. But instead, she did something that sent chills down his spine, not from fear, but from pure amazement. She turned to him, her deep, intelligent eyes locking onto his. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, she bowed her head. Tom's breath caught. Was this gratitude? The cubs, as if taking their mother's lead, mimicked her movement. The smallest one placed a tiny paw over its chest before stretching it toward Tom, a gesture so human-like, it nearly brought tears to his eyes. It was time to go. The mother bear gently nudged her cubs toward the door. But before stepping outside, she did something even more astonishing. She wiped her paws on the doormat. Tom could only stand in awe as each cub did the same, their tiny prints pressing into the fabric before they carefully stepped back into the snowy wilderness. She turned one last time, raising her massive paw in what could only be described as a wave. The cubs followed, their tiny paws lifting in perfect unison. And just like that, they disappeared into the white horizon, leaving behind a story that no one would ever believe if Tom hadn't witnessed it himself.